Hi, and welcome back to Political Science 101. We are on Chapter 8 today, Securing the New Nation, 1789 to 1800. Our learning outcomes today are describe the creation of the federal government under the new Constitution, describe how disagreements over how the United States should be governed led to political divisions, and discuss some of the individuals who took strong stands on each side. Outline the country's development of a two-party political system, discuss the issues of John Adams' presidency and explain how he and the country dealt with them, and explain the convoluted political process that made Thomas Jefferson president in 1800, including the constitutional changes designed to mend the problem. Okay, so although the Revolutionary War for Independence, actually had been won, the Constitution battle really had not been. It was ratified, but there were a lot of debates on either side. For instance, Alexander Hamilton was worried that common people could not handle democracy and would be confused by the challenges of running a nation. Others, like Thomas Jefferson, were concerned that a powerful centralized federal government would take away coveted liberties. So you have these polar opposites, and you're going to see how that really tears the country apart. And your primary source document this week is to read President George Washington's farewell address, which he takes a huge chunk in there where he addresses the two-party system he is completely against. He will not pick sides. And his presidential cabinet, he has 3 what we would call Democrats and 3 what we would call Republicans, because he wants to hear each side before he makes his decision. Now, sure, he did lean more to what we would consider a Democrat today, but he just wanted to hear independently before he chose. And so he had those people on his cabinet for a reason. He would not pick a side. Okay. Let's see. Creating the new government. Who is a citizen? In 1790, the Naturalization Act, legislation which declared that among immigrants to the United States, only free white persons could become citizens. And of course, that excludes women, excludes slaves, excludes any other ethnicity other than European. And of course, we've talked about core and periphery. So the core would be European men that own property, and the periphery would be everyone else that doesn't fit that criteria. The first citizens, free white persons. It goes on in your book and says that this obviously limited Black people, Native Americans, and Asians, which would be considered the periphery. These restrictions continued for almost a century. Obviously limited Black people, Native Americans, Asians, we were talking about. And in 1870, African Americans were allowed to become citizens, but women were not able to vote. Okay, white women also had few property rights. Once she was married, anything and everything she owned became the property of her husband. It was not seen as different. All right, let's skip down to, we already talked about George Washington. As president, he was a very honest war leader. His soldiers adored him. He was the obvious choice to lead the new government. Let's see, he never ran for office. He retired from the public life altogether before he was elected. He really didn't want to come back. This new republic was really ground that had never been trod before. And he even said that, I walk on untrodden ground. He knew that Washington knew he needed to be very, very careful. He was so presidential in manner. It was just amazing, as you read here. The Federalists proposed calling him His Excellency, His Highness. And Washington himself actually came up with being called Mr. President, and he did not want to wear his His military attire. He wanted only to wear American-made suits and to look like someone else and not see his entitlement, his service as entitlement. Okay. The cabinet, super interesting, his cabinet, where you pick people to serve on your cabinet. Washington appointed Thomas Jefferson as the first Secretary of State. He was an anti-federalist. He appointed Treasury Secretary was Alexander Hamilton. He was a Federalist. Then you had Henry Knox, Secretary of War, and he also was, he was actually with Alexander Hamilton. He was a Federalist. And then also Edmund Randolph was Attorney General. So you kind of had it split. He loved the balance of perspectives that Washington sought. Oh, I'm sorry. Hamilton and Knox actually favored the centralized government. They were Federalists. Randolph, oh, I think I said that. Randolph and Jefferson favored greater power of the state on the state level, and they were anti-federalists. Okay, and he really liked that balance of perspectives. Okay. We began running into problems when we hit some taxes, dealing with the whiskey tax in 1794. Really was upsetting some Pennsylvania farmers. And there was an uprising called the Whiskey Rebellion. And George Washington issued a proclamation and sent 13,000 troops to quell the rebellion. He was asserting his authority as the government to say you cannot rebel this way. What was really interesting, before there was kind of a rift in George Washington's cabinet, is on page 140. It talks about over dinner and wine one night, Jefferson and Hamilton did not get along, okay, because of their polarities, because of their two-party system. They really kind of hated each other. And but one night they went to dinner, and they came upon a compromise where Hamilton would instruct the supporters of his economic plan to favor relocating the seat of the government to Washington, D.C., along the Potomac, and Jefferson would allow Hamilton's plan to pass through Congress, his economic plan. So you see this merging of two worlds, these polarities, finding some middle ground, and that's what we learn about polarities. You know, it's not really black and white. There's a lot of things that are agreed upon that we often don't see, and we can get to that middle point with many people. And, you know, like I said before in the last chapter, our book says over and over again that politics really is supposed to be a compromise. It's not one party winning everything and the other party losing everything, and vice versa. It really is supposed to be a compromise of two. Okay. Let's see. I talked about the Whiskey Rebellion. All right, and even though the Whiskey Rebellion was put down, it did allow a lot of sympathizers to arise in the future, so that, you know, lower class merchants would be heard in the future. The Pinckney Treaty, really pretty important. It was an agreement with Spain that opened the Mississippi River to American shipping, and allowed Americans to deposit at New Orleans, which meant the American merchants could warehouse goods in the city. So this kind of really alleviated the Whiskey Rebellion problem, because then they could send their goods to bigger markets, and that really did help, because they were looking for a market for their crop. Along the same time frame, the French Revolution, 1789, in France, the French people are overthrowing their monarchy. Lots of disruption. Okay. Let's see. Jefferson opposed Washington's neutrality and realized that Washington had started looking more into Hamilton, and he got a little upset over this. And he was trying to be neutral in the whole French Revolution. And that angered Jefferson. So this forced, Jefferson to resign as Secretary of State in July 1793. And, it says, and if you do some extra reading, it says that Washington never forgave him because he needed him. He needed his opposing view on his cabinet, and he felt like he had let him down. Because he wanted him there so he could hear both sides. He really wanted to hear both sides. So that was a little drama in the cabinet, the presidential cabinet. Something else we need to talk about is called impressment. Impressment is when British were performing, their British ships would overtake an American ship and they were supposed to be neutral, okay? And because there was a conflict between France and England. France was in conflict with England and Spain, and the Americans had declared neutrality. English ships would come upon American ships, and they would take their sailors and force them into their army or their navy, and that is called impressment. We've heard of the draft. It's when you draft people to serve in war. Sometimes that's called consignment. Not consignment, sorry, conscription, and that's kind of the English word for it, conscription. And then impressment is different. It's almost kind of kidnapping soldiers for your side. Jay's Treaty was very controversial. The Federalists, were extremely angry about it, and they felt that they should align with the French. All right, so let's keep going. The Haitian Revolution, huge. You never hear about it in history. Huge. The biggest slave revolt in history, and it was successful, okay? Actually, George Washington definitely supported the Haitian Rebellion, and there was a rift between the two parties. So the Federalists were for the Haitian Revolution, and the Anti-Federalists were against it. And when Thomas Jefferson becomes president later on, he actually switches the side and says we're against the Haitian Revolution. And it really was about slavery, because what happened, the Haitian Revolution is just fascinating, because what they did is they, slaves in Santo Domingo, Haiti, a Caribbean island, just south of Florida, they revolted, killing planters and burning sugar plantations. And then they used democratic procedures to get their freedom. So they used the knowledge and the ways of democracy, because it was owned by France at the time, to argue for their own freedom and democracy. Just absolutely fascinating. So George Washington kept up trade with Haiti, and it was made up of an independent nation made up of former slaves. Absolutely fascinating story we never hear about, I feel like. Now, when it was reversed and Jefferson was against, he would not trade with Haiti anymore, and he was against it, it began tightening that divide between the two parties, for slavery and against slavery. Black codes started, or slave codes were even more severe, where you couldn't teach them to read, or they were just really afraid of revolt. And then we have Gabriel's Conspiracy, which is the northern states were freeing slaves. They had a plan to free slaves, and the southern states were not, because their crops really needed heavy labor, and the Europeans really just didn't want to do it. And so there became this huge fight between the two. So Gabriel and another slave, they were going to plan this insurrection and overthrow the system the same way they did in Haiti. And it was stopped, and there were harsh, draconian measures, huge measures, to just absolutely terrify any slave of hoping to escape or to find freedom. Okay, Washington's farewell address is in your book, and you're going to be reading that this week. It is so good. It really talks about, it's almost like he was speaking today. So be sure to read that carefully.